Hey everybody, and welcome to another web tips tutorial. My name's Chris and I'll be walking you guys through this one. So our next tutorial is actually going to be about the box model, if you couldn't guess. So what we're looking at is actually the box model itself, guys. Now, if you were with us for our last few tutorials, then you might actually recognize, sorry, I forgot to open this one up again. You might actually recognize this. Excuse me. So to give us an example of the box model in action, what we see here, guys, is this H1 tag actually has a space above it, okay? And so what I want you to keep in mind is that some elements actually already have a pre-programmed or a pre-specified margin or a padding to the element itself. So you'll see different kind of distortions. Like for instance, we would expect, this H1 tag to be at the top of our document. There's nothing in between. If we look at our H1 here, let's see. Where is our H1? Okay, so if we look at our H1 element here, yes, it's wrapped in a container, which is this div container, but there's nothing really above it. The div doesn't have a height or a width or anything of that nature. So why do we have this weird, strange white gap above our H1? So that's due to the margin. And so let's kind of jump back into what the box model itself is, guys. Okay. So let me do this. Hang on. Boom. Okay. So what we're looking at is the box model once again. And so just to briefly explain how it works, ignore this white space out here. This is nothing. Okay. That doesn't exist on the browser itself. But what we're basically going to have in the center is our content. So our content could be a number of different things. It could be a form field. It could be just some basic text, kind of like this. It could actually be an image or a video or whatever your content is. Just think of this white box as the content itself. So maybe if it was just text, the box might look a little bit more like, like this. Okay. So we'll think of that as just whatever image, content, text, video, whatever we have in there. Okay. So right outside of our content, we have what's called the padding. Now you can actually think of it as just that. The padding is a space. Usually it's transparent, so there won't actually be like this blue color here. It'll be transparent or whatever the background color of the content is. That's what color the padding would be. Okay, but typically the padding itself is transparent, so there's no applying a color to the padding itself. So the padding you can think of as kind of just a cushion between the border and the content. So with that being said, our border sits right outside of our padding. Now, usually, if we didn't apply a padding, our border would actually, well, let's not adjust it. Let's just say our border would actually be like this dashed border around here. So if our padding was set to 0 or we did not apply a padding to it, what we would basically see is our border would be around the content itself. Okay, so this little black line here, even though the border kind of is in this gray area, this darker gray area, that's just for the text, really. So the actual border itself would be like this little black line that's going around here and here. I'll change that to make it a little bigger for you guys. So the border would actually be seated here. And then the margin is the space that kind of surrounds the object itself. So really, if we think about it, our content, padding, and border all kind of encapsulate the content itself. The margin, however, is completely transparent. And it essentially is setting the space between the object, so what is the content, and the space outside of the border. So everything outside of this border technically would be the margin. Okay. So we won't talk about line height and border radius just yet till you guys understand that concept. So let's jump back over into our code editor. We won't be looking at this ugly mess anymore, guys. Don't worry. X. Okay. So I went ahead and populated that in here too, so we can just kind of really see what's happening, or how our actually see our box model for reference while we're on the code editor, but we'll ignore that for now. Display none. Okay. So what we're basically going to do here, guys, is we're going to create an object. Let's just make a basic H1 object. Ignore all that stuff above the body. You don't need to worry about that. That's all just for that box model image. Okay, so we're going to apply an element, or place an element inside of our HTML document. Okay. I'm just using an H1. Once again, you can use an image or a video, excuse me, or pretty much any other content that you can place inside of an HTML document. So for this example, let's just write out Christopher. That's my full name. Go ahead and save it. Okay. So we just have an H1 element here, nothing fancy. Let's go into our CSS file, and we'll actually say H1 curly brackets, because we're just calling the element here. I know we haven't talked too much about CSS, guys, but this is all kind of basics, really. HTML and CSS work in conjunction with each other in a lot of respects. So it's good to have a kind of a basic knowledge of, certain aspects of a CSS document. So, and then again, on the flip side, it's really difficult to describe some concepts of HTML by just using HTML. So with that being said, all I did was I applied a background color. I'll put color here so you know. We just applied a background color to the body, so to the entire browser, or anything inside of the body tag, which would be everything that's visible. We just applied a background color to it of light blue. Okay, and then I'm just going to go over to my H1, and I'm going to say background, we'll give this a purple. Okay. So yeah, it stretches all the way across just because by default, the width of the object itself is 100%. So what we're going to do to kind of get rid of that issue is we're going to say width. Let's see if 300 pixels works. Or maybe I can say inherit. Okay, so we're going to say width 250 pixels. And what we're actually going to do is change the font size to 100 pixels. I'll have to play around with this a little bit. 100, let's try 520. I'm kind of being a little sloppy, guys. Usually you wouldn't set the width of something like that. That's kind of Neanderthalish of me, but just for the purposes of keeping the tutorial quick and easy to understand. So our H1 element has a background that's purple. Change the color to white so we can see it a little better. Now, if you'll notice, we haven't set a margin or a padding or anything for this element. But what's happening is we see this separation between the top of where the purple line starts and the top of the browser itself. And we'll get into some strange issues if we don't understand the concept of the box model and how it's working here, because what actually has happened is our H1 element has a predetermined margin, okay? So if we look back at our box model, I'll just comment that out. If we look back at our box model, we've got our content, our padding, our border, and then our margin on the outside. So this actually doesn't have a padding or a border applied to it. So what you're seeing in this light blue area is just the margin. And that's a predetermined default margin. So you have to really be careful with that. A lot of elements have a default margin or border or padding. So just keep an eye out for that, guys. It's really important in understanding how your web layouts are going to turn out. So let's go ahead, and if we just wanted to get rid of that that specified margin, we could just say margin 0. And that kind of resets us to default. So what a lot of developers do is they'll actually come into their CSS document and they'll put a little star here or asterisk, and they'll just kind of set the defaults for the page. And that's all that does. It kind of applies it to everything. So we could say margin 0, padding 0. And sometimes, depending on whether it's the content is surrounded by, let's say, a container like a div, this may or may not work. So we can see, yeah, that didn't really work. So we'll just leave the defaults alone and we'll apply it specifically to our H1 element, margin 0. And so even though we only see this one number, which pretty much represents pixels or percent or what, 0 really, you can write it without having to put that prefix at the end of it. The pixels or the actual specific measurement, however you're measuring it, whether it's in percentages or pixels or viewport height, viewport width, whatever, we could just put 0 here. So what that's doing is the margin is setting a 0 margin to every side of this object. So if we think about it, let's get rid of that margin 0. We can see that the H1 actually has a predetermined margin top, and it also has a predetermined margin bottom and right. But it does not have a predetermined margin left. Otherwise, we would see a gap here between the left side of the display or the browser and the left side of the actual content itself. So we can kind of test that hypothesis by saying margin left 50 or 50 pixels. And then we can see the actual object itself, including the background, move to the left 50 pixels. Okay. So with that being said, we could technically write out each individual one by itself. So we could say margin top 100 pixels. We could say margin right 100 pixels. We could say margin bottom 100 pixels, or we could say margin left 100 pixels. So to test our, ignore this. To test our margin, what we'll do is we'll go back into our HTML document and we'll just add a paragraph here with 10 words. So we can actually see that it's separated our text here that's underneath it in our HTML document by 100 pixels of margin. Okay, so we can see that 100 pixels there. We can see 100 pixels here. We can see 100 pixels here. Now we could, if we wanted to, kind of apply a margin of different sizes. They don't all have to be the same. We could even give it, let's say, a 400 pixel top, a 200 pixel left, and we could give it a, let's say a 10 pixel bottom. And we can see that text move back up to it because that margin on the bottom is a lot smaller now. So we could do that. I mean, we could write out all 4 lines of code here like this. But instead of doing that, there's actually 2 alternative methods that I wanted to show you. So the first alternative method is we're just going to write out margin. And then we're going to apply 100 pixels of margin to every side of the object. And we do that simply by just writing margin 100 pixels. Okay? Let's give it some space so you guys can see what's going on. So we can do that by just writing margin 100 pixels. That's going to apply 100 pixels of margin to the top, right, bottom, and left, all 4 sides of that object. If we wanted to be more specific and apply a specific margin to the top and bottom versus the left and the right, we would say 100 pixels. We'd write it the same. We'd say margin. Then we would write 100 pixels, and that's going to be the top and bottom. And then we'll say 50 pixels on the left and right. And so we can see that that object moved over. So now, if we write the shorthand version this way, we've got 100 pixels on top, 100 pixels on bottom, 50 pixels on the right, and then 50 pixels on the left. Okay? And just like doing that, we could apply each one individually as well using the margin attribute. So we could say 150 pixels on the bottom and 20 pixels on the left. So the way that this works, if we write all 4 specifically, it goes from it starts at the top and works its way clockwise. Okay, so it's basically applying 100 pixels top, 50 pixels right, 150 pixels bottom, and then left is last. I know it seems a little strange, but trust me, you'll get used to it. I did. I used to want to start at the left for some reason. I don't know why. But now it's just kind of second nature. So what we're looking at again, guys, is we've got a margin. We've got basically an object here. This is our content. And then we've got a margin of 100 pixels on top, 50 on right, 150 on the bottom. We can see that separating our text. And then 20 pixels on the left. Now, what happens if we wanted to center it? Well, we could do that as well by just simply writing auto. And that you want to apply that auto to the left and the right. So it will center them equally on the page or on the display. So as we move this, it stays in the center. Okay. Or we could say, if we remember our pattern, it goes clockwise. So 100 pixels on top, auto on right, 100 pixels on bottom, auto on left. So we see that it doesn't move. That's pretty much the same as writing 100 pixels auto. Well, it is the same. Okay. So we've seen the margin and how the margin kind of affects our object, but where is our border and our padding? So for the border, guys, the border, we're basically, we have 3 attributes that we're going to apply to the border, okay? And they're going to be the border size or width, so the thickness of the border line. They're going to be the border, I guess you could say pattern. And then they're going to be the border, so you have the border width, the border padding, and or the border, pattern, and then you have the border color. Okay, so how that works is we write border. We're going to say, actually, let's say 5 pixels. So it's going to be 5 pixels in width. It's going to be solid. Now you could write solid or dashed. Let's do dashed. Black. Okay, so super easy. We just basically gave it a dashed border that's black and 5 pixels. Each line is 5 pixels wide. So if we change this to 15, see, they just get fatter. Okay. Okay. All right, just making a few adjustments here, guys, to make it look a little nicer and neater so you guys really know what's happening. Okay. So there we have it. We've got our border. Actually, let's change our border to white. So we would just go here. We would say border 15 pixels white. Okay. So now we can see that our margin is separating our border from or excuse me, our margin, our border is separating our margin and our actual content. So that's the content. Here's the border, and here's the margins, right? The margins that we set down here. Okay, so we can see all that. That's all fine and dandy, but what about the padding? So padding works similar to margin in that the padding is actually transparent as well. So the only reason our margin is light blue is because the body of the document is light blue. Otherwise, it would just be white or transparent. There's really no applying a color specifically to a margin or a padding. Okay, so it works the same. So long ways, we could say padding top. Just to give us an example, padding top 100 pixels and see what happens. Oop. So we want to go padding dash top. Okay, so now we can see that our content has moved or added, or there's 100 pixels of padding between our border and our content. So that's interesting. That kind of gave us a different kind of look there. That looks pretty cool. So now we've got a margin, which goes all around the actual object itself. The border, which separates the content and the margin. And then the padding, which separates our border from our content. So here, we just applied a top padding, okay? So let's say we wanted to add a padding on the bottom too. We could go long ways and write it out like this. We'll put 100 pixels on the bottom as well. And then we could even say adding right. Let's give it 50 pixels. I write that right. Okay, so we can't really see since we specified the width of our H1. We can't really see the padding on the right. So this is kind of a little tricky bug that you guys would have to kind of figure out. So let's see if we get rid of our width. Okay, yeah, we still can't see our padding on the right. So typically, though, you don't really want a padding on the right. And the reason is because when your objects start to get smaller, that padding is actually going to reflect off the edge of the page, okay, usually. But since we have actually a predetermined width here, we're not seeing that affecting the right side. So we'll just get rid of padding right. Okay, let's get rid of that altogether. And we'll get rid of the padding left too. Okay. And so we see that content move back in place. But just to give you an idea, of the dynamic of it, that's basically what's happening. So let's expand this again. What we're seeing, to recap, is our content. The purple area would represent our padding, which is transparent. It only takes the color of the background color of the element itself or the object. And then we've got our border, which is 5 pixels. It's dashed and it's white. Otherwise, we could say solid. Now it's solid. Let's change it back. It looks cooler. Okay. And then we've got our margin on the outside, which is kind of controlling, in a way, in a sense, the space between the browser edges and the border itself. So really. And so now hopefully you guys have a clear understanding of how that works. Just to recap, we could get rid of the padding bottom and top and just say padding the same way we did with the margin. And let's give it 150 pixels on top and 0 on the right and left. So then we have 150 pixels of padding on the top and the bottom and 0 pixels of padding on the right and the left. Same way goes if we wanted to apply them each manually, then we could go top, which is 150 pixels, right, which would be 0. Then we would add bottom, we'll say 50 pixels, and left 20 pixels. And we can see how that works. Okay, guys, so hopefully you guys have a really good understanding of how margin and padding and border works now, the shorthand and the longhand way. Okay. The last kind of two things I wanted to talk about is the line height and the border radius. So if we understand how border works, the border radius is nothing different. It's just adding this beveled or whatever circular kind of edge to the object itself. So it basically would be adding that border. It would be changing the border edge to a rounded edge. So maybe really I should kind of do this. Because these two, there wouldn't be a border radius for these guys. There wouldn't be that beveled edge because they actually would be transparent and you wouldn't be able to see them. So the border, the border radius would take that border, and depending on how many pixels or what percentage you used, you could actually create that rounded off edge. So let's show you how that works first. So here we would basically say border radius, and let's say 20 pixels. And boom, we've got a rounded out edge. And you guys can see that. Okay. We could use percentages. Same goes for padding and margin. We could use percentages. Gets a little tricky if you don't really keep track of it. But we could say border radius 20%. And what will actually happen is it kind of starts to follow an oblong or like a circular shape. So if we said 50%, we can see that it pretty much turns it into an oval or a circle. Or if we said 100%, it doesn't change really. But if we said 50 pixels, it would curve it at 50 pixels so that the distance from this edge to this edge, where they go from rounded and they become completely straight, this distance would be 50 pixels, basically, if that makes sense. You don't really need to know that. You can pretty much wing these for the most part, but you need to understand the concept. So let's say if I change it to 150 pixels, you would see that it's still trying to straighten out at the end, as opposed to when we said, when we used percents, say 25%, and we can see that it's trying to follow that oblong shape around. So that's really the major difference between using specific measurements and relative ones like percent. And that 25% is based on the size of the object as it is now. Okay, which would include the content, the padding. Yeah, pretty much just the content and the padding. The border just kind of surrounds all of that. So now we understand border radius. Let's change this back to something more reasonable. Let's say maybe 10 pixels. And then let's actually change our border down to maybe 5 pixels. So it looks a little bit more reasonable. Let's make our padding 150 pixels on top and bottom, and then auto on the left and the right. Okay. And that is going to bring us back to line height. So what's line height? So line height is basically, if you imagine this H1 element takes up a specific area now. It's text. So line height affects the text height. So let's do this. Let's say, just to experiment, line heights, let's say 50 pixels. So what that's going to do is it's basically going to say, well, we know that our text here is 100 pixels. So actually, let's kind of make that less confusing. Let's say 100 pixels, and we'll see that it doesn't move at all. It's already sitting on top of a line height of 100 pixels. But if we were to say 150 pixels, we can see that our text would actually move down, okay? And that basically moves it down. Since our font size is 100, that would move it down half of what our font size is. So we said 150 pixels. If the font size is already 100, it's going to move it down half of the height of the font. So once again, if we were to say font or line height 100 pixels, nothing really changes. We could actually get rid of this and comment that out. Excuse me. And it kind of gives it's a little bit of that predetermined padding that it has. But if we bring that back, you see it shrink just a little bit, but it gets right up to the edge of the text and the line height. So if we were to say 200, it's going to move that down from where it originally was down to basically underneath it. So line height gets a little tricky. I don't use it too much, guys, but I wanted to mention it. It's a funky little thing. It can really help in some interesting scenarios, but for the most part, you don't really mess with the line height too much. Yeah, so anyways, we'll leave the line height alone. We'll save this up, and let's just get a quick little recap and see if we can spot where our margin, padding, and border are. Okay, so let's bring that back. So we can see we've got content, which would be Christopher here. We've got our border, or excuse me, we've got our padding, which we actually did defined as auto. So let's say 50 pixels. Excuse me. So we've got our padding. And then we've got our border that runs around the padding. And then we've got our margin. So I kind of went a little bit in depth, like way too in depth about it, because I really want you guys to have a strong understanding of positioning. And when it comes to positioning and getting your web layouts correct, it really has a lot to do with understanding which elements have, say, default paddings, default margins already applied to them. So you know when to reset it to 0. You know why it's positioned the way that it is. And it really just makes things easier when it comes to positioning your content, guys. So once again, thanks for joining me for this web tips tutorials. Our next web tip tutorial is going to be more focused on positioning, and we're probably going to get into some more about web layouts and possibly even do a full-on web layout ourselves. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you guys like the content, or leave me comments below for anybody who has comments on how I can improve my tutorials. And I will see you guys next time on the next Web Tips Tutorials.